Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a massive paradigm shift in development economics. Honestly, it's time we completely rethink how we actually measure human progress. For decades, the global conversation was just totally obsessed with raw wealth. We naturally assume that if a country has a massive gross domestic product, it's automatically developed. We see those trillion-dollar economies and instantly stamp successful right on them. But let's pause for a second. Does a huge GDP actually improve the day-to-day lives of the people living there? Because history, and honestly the hard data, prove over and over that economic growth on paper absolutely does not guarantee access to clean water, basic healthcare, or fundamental freedoms. We have to look past the money in the bank to see the real, qualitative measure of human progress. And that highlights exactly where our focus needs to shift. See, traditional economics, it obsesses over output. It's all about efficiently allocating scarce resources just to produce an ever-expanding range of goods. It's basically a model built on scarcity and efficiency. But development economics, that takes a much wider, way more holistic lens. It focuses on the whole picture, the total societal transformation needed to actually raise living standards. It's not just the math of the market. We're talking about complex, intertwined social, political, and institutional changes that literally lift millions out of poverty, malnutrition, and illiteracy. This brings us to the groundbreaking economist Amartya Sen. He proposed a revelation that completely flips this whole paradigm on its head. He argued that true development is, at its core, about giving people the freedom to choose their own destinies. Think about it. It's not just about making sure someone has a few extra bucks in their pocket. It's about whether they have the actual capability and freedom to live a life they genuinely value. Under this framework, human development is the ultimate end goal. Economic growth? Well, that's just the vehicle we use to get there. So to achieve this grand vision of development, a society has to bulldoze some massive obstacles. If a person is chronically ill, if they're denied a basic education, or they're trapped by corrupt governance that just drains their community's resources, they are fundamentally not free. So no matter how many millions of barrels of oil or tons of gold that society exports, it's not truly developed. These barriers constrain human capability at its absolute core. They literally prevent people from participating fully in their own economies. This brilliant contrast really becomes clear when we look at how we measure things. Economic growth is basically a quantitative numbers game. Your gross national product, GDP, import-export balances. Human development, on the other hand, tries to measure the qualitative, often really messy reality of daily life. It's highly subjective. You just cannot capture a nation's soul, the safety of its neighborhood streets, or the sheer potential of its kids on a GDP spreadsheet. You just can't. Now, when we zoom out globally, the picture gets even more complex. Demographic factors and globalization are massive forces here. For example, did you know that thicker ethnic networks can actually boost trade opportunities? They bridge trust gaps across borders, and migrant networks expertly navigate international waters to facilitate investment. But flip that coin, and deep ethnic divisions, especially without inclusive governance, can completely paralyze a society and make it so much harder to improve the quality of life. It's like this delicate high-wire balancing act of global variables. As we analyze how nations actually build their wealth, we usually see two heavily diverging paths. First, you've got the knowledge economy. This builds sustainable, long-term advantages through ideas, innovation, and high productivity. Think bustling tech hubs and top-tier universities. Contrast that with a resource-based economy, which relies almost entirely on what it can literally dig out of the ground. Oil, gas, timber, you name it. Now, while resource extraction generates massive, immediate income, relying solely on natural resources sets a surprisingly dangerous trap. And that brings us to a really fascinating yet kind of tragic paradox known as the resource curse. You'd think winning the geological lottery and finding massive oil reserves would be an absolute blessing, right? But ironically, an abundance of natural wealth can actually trap a country. What happens is elites tend to hoard that sudden influx of wealth, which means they don't need to tax their citizens. And without that need for taxes, they conveniently lose any incentive to democratize or build strong civic institutions. This consistently leads to massive corruption, higher poverty rates, and way weaker long-term growth compared to nations that, well, just had to innovate instead of drill. On the flip side, some nations have successfully broken through by taking a totally different approach. They consciously open their domestic markets and aggressively embrace export-led growth. Basically, they find a highly specific niche in the global economy where they have an advantage, manufacture goods, and export them to gain hard currency. This strategy is exactly what the Asian tigers, Hong Kong, South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore used back in the 70s and 80s to massively speed up their industrialization and vault themselves into highly developed status. It's a real game changer. But progress is incredibly hard when you're up against massive systemic roadblocks. Get this, the World Bank estimates that corruption alone spikes the cost of doing global business by a staggering 10%. It basically functions as a massive invisible tax on development. Add relative deprivation to the mix, where people see others advancing rapidly while they're left behind, which is a huge driver of internal conflict, and the picture gets even bleaker. Plus, authoritarian regimes and bloated military budgets rapidly siphon vital resources straight away from civilian growth, education, and health infrastructure. So, with all these super complex variables, health, wealth, freedom, education, how do economists and policymakers actually measure development? Well, in 1990, the United Nations Development Program introduced a brilliant tool, the Human Development Index, or the HDI. This was a huge deal. It was a formal, explicit acceptance by the global community that we desperately needed a broader, more encompassing indicator than just GDP to track real human progress. The HDI cleverly boils development down to a clean 0 to 1 scale, and it's based on 3 equally weighted pillars. First up is longevity, which measures life expectancy at birth to gauge public health. Second is knowledge, calculating adult literacy and school enrollment to evaluate access to education. And third is a basic standard of living. This uses real GDP per capita, but it smartly adjusts it for purchasing power parity because, let's face it, a dollar in New York does not have the same buying power as a dollar in New Delhi. It perfectly marries quantitative economic data with the qualitative realities of health and education. Let's actually look at how this shakes out in reality. Using some historical data from 2010 makes the index super easy to grasp. Basically, anything below a 0.49 is considered low development, which is exactly where Nigeria sat at 0.42. Conversely, a score above 0.8 represents very high development, and that's where a country like Finland scored a 0.87. Standardizing the metric like this is fantastic because it allows economists to rapidly compare the living conditions of vastly different nations at a single glance. But, and this is absolutely crucial to remember, the HDI is definitely imperfect. Because it relies heavily on a national average, it can completely gloss over massive inequalities hidden within a single country. I mean, think about the jarring difference between a booming, hyper-modern city and a struggling rural community just a few miles away. The HDI completely misses that. Critics also point out that giving equal weight to those 3 categories is a little bit arbitrary. And perhaps most importantly, the index entirely ignores brutal realities that dictate daily life for millions. Things like crime rates, political corruption, and severe environmental degradation. So that brings us back to Amartya Sen. If true development is fundamentally about expanding human freedom and removing obstacles, then what exactly does freedom look like today? Think about our hyper-connected world for a second. Is access to the internet now a fundamental freedom? If you are entirely cut off from the globe's information network, are you truly free to choose your destiny? It's a fascinating thought, and a stark reminder of just how constantly evolving the field of development economics really is. Thanks for exploring this explainer with me today.